Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining the Startup Societies Foundation podcast. Today, we are joined by Alexander Salter. He is an associate professor at Texas Tech University, and he is a scholar in the field of competitive governance. Alexander, thank you for joining the show.
Thanks very much, Joe. Great to be here.
Absolutely. And I've been wanting to talk to you for a while because I've been seeing a couple of your papers being published and shared around. So I'm glad to have you on. One of the most recent ones that I have seen is about, the title is Polycentric Sovereignty, the Medieval Constitution, Governance Quality, and the Wealth of Nations. And maybe I'm starting out with the granular details before talking about broader concepts, but it was just so interesting that I thought I might as well ask. In your view, what was the political structure of medieval Europe?
Great place to start. So this is actually a part of a longer research project that I'm working on with my colleague, Andy Young, who's also a professor in the Rawls College. And we've been engaging this recent literature in political and economy and development economics that basically asserts that strong, centralized, hierarchical states were necessary for the West to get rich. And if you look at the various mechanisms that they point to, basically why they say that's the case, they have some convincing explanations for why strong, centralized states can do good things, but they don't have very good explanations for what stops strong, centralized states from doing bad things. Right? It's very easy to point to the Low Countries in England, places that had really good, strong central states comparatively early in Western political history and also developed comparatively early in Western political history. But if you will point to those cases by saying, look, they developed because they had big, strong states, you have to also answer the tough question, well, the Soviet Union had a big, strong state. Cuba has a big, strong state. North Korea has a big, strong state. Why aren't they rich? And so the answer is, it's not just about having a big, strong state. It matters at least as much what you do with it. So you need something to actually structure the incentives of those who wield political power to make sure they do good things. What was that thing doing the structuring historically? Andy and I say, we can't actually understand good governance in the West without referring to the governance institutions of the High Middle Ages, what we call the medieval constitution. And basically due to a network of governance practices that basically amount to overlapping jurisdictions, competitive governance, and a lot of governance that was de facto privately owned, there are these really good incentives to actually create political procedures that were broadly beneficial. And so we're trying to add nuance to the state capacity literature while also saying, look, you guys are missing an important part of the story, which is that a lot of this was private and a lot of it was competitive. And that's where the good incentives and good information is coming from that we take for granted.
So what do you mean by competitive or private in this sense? Because a lot of people, when they think about medieval Europe, they don't think about those terms. They don't see the realm of corporations or private property. They think of knights and castles and kings. So could you sort of explain what is this order? Why do you call it a polycentric competitive private order?
Sure. The concept can be a little bit counterintuitive, but when you actually dig into it, you realize that if you're a mid-level noble, you hold a fief according to the permission or agreement with some lord higher up the hierarchy, higher up the food chain. The idea was you would agree to hold that land and provide certain military services in exchange for which you had almost exclusive usufruct rights to the land. And so there was meaningful political exchange and de facto privatization of political authority. Now, by itself, that's not enough to guarantee that there are good things happening, right? We can all think of people who squander their property rather than use it productively. What was going on in the background was a series of arrangements that Andy and I called polycentric sovereignty. Basically, as representative institutions developed, you had these strong concurrence and consensus norms evolving amongst what we call the shareholders of the realm. Basically, those who wielded de facto political power had an economic stake in the realms that they were overseeing. And because of the decentralized nature of coercive capacity, basically anybody could raise an army. If there was going to be any significant changes to governance, it had to be broadly consensual. So you had what the economist James Buchanan called a generality norm, which basically means you can't have major governance innovations unless most of the players who are at the bargaining table actually agree. Now, this created the situation that we call polycentric sovereignty. The concept of polycentricity dates from the economists and political scientists Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom, who popularized it in the middle of the 20th century. Basically, it means that political authority is fractured, overlapping, and concurrent. Rather than a monopoly of political authority, a lot of functions were disaggregated and allocated to various parts of the feudal hierarchy. So rather than just having one guy in charge of everything, there were many governance providers, some of whom frequently competed with each other to try and give people better deals. You know, settle in my land, I'll make sure that I give you a better tax deal for the produce that you have to give me every year, or something like that. And so over a long period of time, as these arrangements evolved, what you got was very much a proto-liberalism. The idea that there was going to be a politics by exchange amongst the relevant shareholders of the realm, such that the only changes that could make it through the political filter, so to speak, were ones that were willing, or able, I should say, to be broadly wealth and welfare enhancing. And so without that starting point, I really don't think that the Western state building project would have resulted anywhere near as successfully as it had, because ultimately that's where we get the idea like the rule of law from. As F.A. Hayek said in the Constitution of Liberty, what we care about is generalized liberty. That's what's important. But where liberty, capital L, comes from is the various chartered liberties, plural, of the High Middle Ages. So without these specific bargains for political authority, we could not have gotten the Great Enrichment and the Wealth of Nations that Adam Smith talked about.
So maybe to make things a little more concrete, what is an example of one of these shareholders of the realm?
So you can think of it basically like any feudal magnate, again, anybody who holds land and permission from a higher liege lord. Frequently the princes of the church, the bishops also held significant tracts of land that they basically managed on behalf of the church. Especially in the areas that are now Germany, bishops were not just spiritual authorities, they were frequently temporal authorities as well. They would raise armies, they would govern provinces. And so when we say shareholders of the realm, we literally mean people who owned land and the factors of production on it, treated it as their capital, and had an incentive to steward its value. Now, of course, this didn't always work perfectly, right? A lot of the reason that medieval law was so robust is because violence was so likely to break out. So we're not claiming that medieval Europe was a paradise or anything like that. But without this process, whereby you had actual people who owned in a meaningful sense political authority, and the sense that they were residual claimants to the political decisions. Basically, if a good political decision was made, the value of their estates would increase, and if bad political decisions were made, the value of their estates would decrease. Without that structuring the political bargains going forward, I don't think we have much of a reason to think that we would have ever gotten the Great Enrichment in the West.
So that might be the case. I do think that a couple people might push back against the idea because of, well, maybe not against the idea, but maybe some interpretations of your work of saying that this is actually a good thing, or it led to a good thing, because of one could see medieval Europe as the result of the decline of ordered stability from the Roman Empire, and that these feudal systems, or what you're calling private or polycentric systems, were sort of the messy aftermath of that political empire. Do you think that's a misinterpretation of history, or do you think that people are vindicated in being wary of taking positive examples out of medieval Europe?
I think that's a reasonable counter-argument. I don't think it's actually right. So one thing that you could point out is that although Rome had a high degree of political stability in a sort of unified, centralized empire for a long time, they didn't have anything like sustained increases in standards of living for the majority of its citizens. So the Great Enrichment had to happen a long, long time later, more than 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire. And admittedly, the years after the fall of Rome in the West were pretty messy. It's no longer historiographically correct to refer to them as the Dark Ages. Nonetheless, the term is popular for obvious reasons. Because when there's a vacuum of political authority and local elites are competing often violently to establish themselves, that can be pretty nasty for most people. But by the time these new political boundaries were drawn, and by the time that you get to the High Middle Ages, the time period that's usually classified as beginning in the 12th and 13th centuries, you actually had some really impressive political and economic developments. Here's just one example, the revival of international trade. International trade plummeted after Rome fell and gradually recovered as wealth and political situations stabilized, and all of a sudden you had people rediscovering ancient Roman law, but now there's no imperial sovereign anymore to enforce it. And so they had to using Roman law as a basic starting point, devise these self-enforcing commercial codes for structuring medieval trade. So that's just one way in which you might view the eventual Great Enrichment, the massive increases in living standards that we saw starting with the Industrial Revolution. You might actually think of that as being something that we had to get away from Rome to get. History gives us many, many examples of centralized hierarchical empires. It gives us one example of the hockey stick graph in terms of sustained permanent increases in income per capita. That's the big thing that we have to explain. And if you're going to explain it by saying, oh, state capacity, or oh, centralized governance, then you're faced with the very troubling question of, okay, why didn't it happen in Rome? Why didn't it happen in Babylon? Why didn't it happen in China? There's so many other places that it could have happened but didn't. So there has to be something special about what happened in medieval Western Europe from the high Middle Ages going into early modernity.
So the subject of this is polycentricity and competitive governance, but the agents of change in sort of the model that you're espousing is what you call sovereign entrepreneurs, like your paper, Sovereign Entrepreneurship. Can you sort of define what that is and how they play into this proposed system that you're thinking?
Of course, that was a very fun paper to write. So I got this idea of writing about sovereign entrepreneurship as I got into the entrepreneurship literature in economics and political economy. And there's actually a big debate within economics and political economy about how to conceive entrepreneurship. What does it mean to be an entrepreneur? What is entrepreneurship? One interesting way of looking at it, which builds on the writings of Frank Knight and Ludwig von Mises, is that there's an entrepreneurial element associated with all human action when you act to bear risk under conditions of genuine uncertainty. So taking that as our starting point, we can classify pretty much any business firm, any business venture. The entrepreneurial element there is the business owners and the property that they bring to the business venture. Because their judgment in organizing production lines and advancing a production plan is the ultimate thing bearing the residual risk value. I took that perspective from industrial organization and the theory of the firm and actually applied it to political operatives, political agents. So in my conception, pretty much every society has a structure of what I call political property rights. A political property right is some device for deciding who has the authority to make political decisions, under what circumstances, and what the payoffs resulting from those decisions are. Every political property right structure has some hierarchical element to it. At the apex of a political property right structure, you have the sovereign, somebody whose political property rights are not enforced by any third party, but instead are self-enforced. And that's the nature of sovereignty. And so I'm sort of connecting the literatures on entrepreneurship with the classical political theory literature on the nature of sovereignty. But unlike Jean Bodin or Hobbes or someone like that who has a very unconstrained view of sovereignty, my view of sovereignty is very much that the sovereign is constrained. They face real resource constraints, they face opportunity costs in making their decisions. The only thing they're not constrained by is having to take instructions from somebody up the food chain on the political property rights hierarchy, because they themselves are the ultimate enforcers. And so using this typology of sovereign entrepreneurship, we can apply that to the era of early state building in Western Europe coming out of the High Middle Ages and going into early modernity. And we can see a rearrangement of political property rights away from feudal magnates, away from nobles and guilds and bishops, etc., and towards the central government, kings, princes, representative institutions that eventually became parliaments.
So you're spelling the story of the chaos of the Middle Ages. It evolved into these battling lords that started developing sort of an ordered system of polycentricity through the engagement of sovereign entrepreneurs. And this later evolved into something that closely resembles towards the sort of centralized states that are characteristic of the Enlightenment. So as we're going through this period, you're seeing less and less of this original sovereign entrepreneurship or this polycentricity. But in your work, you point out that throughout these steps from the Middle Ages to the Westphalian system that were associated with, there were other people that were still espousing this political entrepreneurship, including the work of Frederick in his work, Frederick the Great's Anti-Machiavelli. Can you tell me a little bit about the work that you did on that private prerogative, public purpose, and political entrepreneurship under Frederick the Great?
I'd be happy to. So the Germanic polities, including Prussia, are particularly interesting because by the time that states were becoming centralized and more or less coherent, there was a specific school of what you might call proto-economic thought in the various Germanic polities that we now call cameralism. If I had to sum up cameralism in one sentence, it would basically be that you should run the state like a business. The state is the prince and the property that he owns, and the idea for the prince is to employ his property in profitable ways that increase the wealth of the entire realm. And so I first encountered Frederick's writings on statecraft as I was studying early modern Germany, precisely because I was interested in cameralism and the writers and thinkers of that tradition. And at the time, if you're a prince of a Germanic polity or any Western European polity in the 17th, 18th, even up to the 19th centuries, you would have to read Niccolo Machiavelli. You would have to read The Prince. And the kind of statecraft that Machiavelli recommended was pretty hardball, pretty brutal, and then oftentimes dishonest and not really conducive to overall social stability. It's very much a power politic mentality. Frederick the Great apparently didn't like this when he had to study it, so he anonymously wrote his pamphlet advocating a different style of governance. Now, I should put in a disclaimer here. Rulers are always looking to talk up their own philosophy and make themselves look great. There are many, many times in Frederick's own career and path of power where he behaved in an underhanded manner. So I'm not holding him up as like a perfect, enlightened absolutist despot or anything like that. What's interesting, though, is that he saw fit to express a new philosophy of governance. And when we read that philosophy of governance, it looks very much like a statement of a philosophy where the ruler has to have skin in the game, and the ruler has to employ his own personal assets in the service of the state to make sure that what happens to his own patrimony happens to the entire state and vice versa. So no more are we going to look at the state as something that we use to enrich ourselves at the expense of others. Instead, we got to figure out how to get that tide that lifts all ships. And I found that that change in mentality was interesting because it helps link up the late Renaissance ideal of statecraft with the ideals of enlightened absolutism, which were sort of the cornerstone of early modernity in the state era.
So how did Anti-Machiavelli, how did it impact the states of the region of Prussia? And what are some examples of neo-cameralism in action?
Ooh, very good questions. So in terms of the historical influence, the pamphlet itself has a pretty interesting story. It was written anonymously, but everybody very quickly found out who wrote it because Frederick's favorite intellectual, or at least one of his favorite intellectuals, was Voltaire. And Voltaire himself was a very big fan of Frederick the Great. And so Voltaire took the pamphlet to Amsterdam and popularized it. And it soon became a sensation on the intellectual scene of Europe. And so it sort of helped establish Frederick's reputation. In terms of the concrete lessons in the pamphlet, one of the things that struck me most immediately was the idea that there are principles for government, but you can't put the state on autopilot. And what I mean by that is you can't rely on rules and procedures and constitutions to actually do the work for you. At some point, you're going to have to make a judgment call for how to employ political and economic resources in the service of the state to actually create broad-based economic growth. And so Frederick is all about figuring out under what circumstances do you want to delegate judgment to somebody else versus what situations you want to actually retain that judgment to make sure that you're actually calling the shots. So one of the most difficult trade-offs is this idea of perhaps you're the prince of a small Germanic polity and you're not necessarily the most capable military leader. There's no shame in that. Everybody can't be born with all the intellectual and political and economic gifts. So it makes perfect sense for a prince to employ experienced generals. But of course, there's a principal agent problem here. Once you put someone in charge of their military and they get sufficiently powerful, that might pose a problem for the legitimacy of your rule. And so thinking in terms of those principal agent problems and how to navigate them, and especially how to do it in a way that does not do violence to the overall wealth of the realm, I found that a very interesting thought process in terms of the ideas with which these early modern rulers were grappling with. Another idea that struck me was this idea that Frederick promotes. He says, look, a lot of classical rulers in the classical statecraft tradition hold commerce as sort of dirty and low and not a great thing. That's nonsense. Commerce is great. You want to promote commerce. You want to promote trade. You want to promote manufacturers. Too many sovereigns are all about building up a big war chest and then keeping that capital available so they can finance an army on a quick notice. But if that capital is not being put to work, it's dead capital. It could actually be put to work to develop the state. And so it's the prince's responsibility to sort of make sure that the foundational requirements for state development and governance are set so that you can have markets and trade and broad-based economic growth. Now, this didn't work immediately, right? When we look at the places where the Great Enrichment started, it was not in early modern Germany. They got there eventually, but it was England and the Low Countries that experienced the first acts of development and modernization. And there are reasons for that. You could argue that the Germanic tradition held back development in the early modern Germanies for reasons that didn't apply to England or Holland or the other Low Countries. So I found it particularly interesting that you had this ruler who was facing a myriad of problems, how to build the state, how to consolidate, while at the same time not amassing so much power that you would necessarily stifle commerce and trade, and navigating those trade-offs and finding ways to do it in a way that was incentive compatible for both governors and governed was a very important way of thinking about the problem that I think is just as relevant to statecraft today as it was 300-400 years ago.
So I know you talk about this in your paper, Private Governance and the Pricing of Political Enterprises, but I think it's a valid question. What do you say to those who say that you're being overly reductionist, reducing things down to market mechanisms for everything, especially something like governance and civic procedures and civic institutions down to these market processes when economically there could be seen as public goods and they don't behave like normal free market mechanisms, or the ethical claim that these things have a higher standing and shouldn't be reduced down to markets. What do you say to those individuals?
That's almost invariably the first objection that I get. And usually what I do is I just own it. Look, the purpose of my project, I try to explain, is to say I'm trying to actually figure out to what extent economic profit can be a foundation for a political order. It's an empirical question whether this actually works or not. And I think that there are conditions under which it does. And so that naturally segues into the public goods argument. A lot of governance is supposedly creating public goods or has to do with the stewardship of common resources. And the idea is that markets cannot really do this very well. So you need a state that's more or less detached from commerce, detached from the market, able to provide those basic governance goods. But when you actually look at where the rubber hits the road in providing those public goods, the governance goods, almost always externalities, positive effects that make somewhere a nice place to live, they're almost always spatially demarcated. It's not just a benefit that you experience in the abstract. If I reduce pollution somewhere in the United States, Los Angeles, say, that makes Los Angeles a nicer place to live. That should mean that Los Angeles's property values go up. That should mean that rents in Los Angeles go up. Right there, there's a market mechanism linking the provision of a public good to a way to capture the increase in value associated with stewarding that public good. And where you can have excludable benefits, you can have market mechanisms at work. And so this is the transition from the literature on political property rights, state building, that sort of conversation, to looking forward to governance in the 21st century. What should be our model going forward? How should we think about the possibilities of seasteads or other floating settlements? What should we think about competitive privately owned and operated city-states? I think that there actually is a compelling argument that using this older literature, not an outdated literature, but an older literature that shows us how to think about how we use political property rights craftsmanship to capture increases in market value. As long as you can do that, as long as you can bundle real estate on which to live with pleasant, positive consequences that otherwise wouldn't be internalizable, then all of a sudden you can have governance for profit, and it can work. Maybe it's scalable, maybe it's not, maybe there are other problems, maybe there are not, but the whole purpose of the project is to figure out where at the margin we can find new ways to govern and new ways to live together peacefully that rely on different mechanisms than the ones that we've relied on so far. So I think your third question was about the ethical argument. That's the one that keeps me up at night a lot of the time, actually. There is something very appealing about this ethical idea that when it comes to the laws of the state, when it comes to governance, we want democracy because there are some things that people should just do for themselves. I'm very fond of quoting G.K. Chesterton on this. It makes perfect sense that we would not want someone to be an astronomer unless they were good at astronomy. But we wouldn't want a man, for example, to outsource writing a love letter to his wife. Doesn't matter if he's not a good writer, doesn't matter if his wife knows. There are some things that you should just do for yourself because that's an important part of being human. And the idea is governance is one of those things. It doesn't matter if you're not particularly good at it. Part of what it means to be human is to contribute to the governance process, to deliberate, to exchange ideas, to come to a consensus. And so I wouldn't say it's a hurdle, but it's a way of thinking that sort of prevents us from going too much pie in the sky. We have to remember that the institutions that we have in liberal democracy are historically very important, and they have a deeply ethically positive or attractive component. So it's not without a little trepidation that we're sort of talking about experiments in governance. But I still think the project is worthwhile, and I'm not yet convinced that those two ways of thinking can ultimately be reconciled to the betterment of humanity.
So I definitely have worries about, what could be the potential outfall of experiments, because of experiments also have a tendency to fail. But obviously experiments are necessary in order to grow. What are some ways in which these more innovative forms of governance, they can create a framework that will sort of address the concerns that you had, which is the idea that at a certain level, all people need to be participants in the polity, or even on the other hand, where you're talking about value capture. How do you make sure that that value captured from civic institutions, which are supposed to be for the benefit of everyone, sort of like a land lease model, where they're capturing public land and capturing the value of that, are there certain safeguards about how that value should be distributed?
That's a really interesting question. So are you talking about in the context of actually existing polities like liberal democracy, or in a hypothetical future private city-state?
Whichever one you think you can have the most interesting answer for.
Okay, so we'll go for the second one then. I think the hardest problem to overcome is if we're talking about innovations in governance and we want to actually try and talk about experimental communities, there's always going to be this paradox of power. If you're going to talk about setting up a governance arrangement, you need that governance arrangement to be strong enough to make sure that they can enforce law and order, provide public goods, etc. But at the same time, you need to make sure that they don't then turn that power on you and prey on you. It's the exact same thing that Madison was talking about in Federalist 51. So in terms of actual constitutional design, I'm not sure it's a problem that can be solved. It's a problem that simply has to be wrestled with anew with each generation. And so ideally, one way that you could address that problem is design a governance system where the governors simply have no incentive to prey on the governed, and in fact are financially punished if they prey on the governed. And so if you set up a privately owned and operated community, a proprietary community, a city-state or something like that, and all of a sudden they started going crazy and oppressing the people who live there, very quickly you would see the value of that enterprise collapse. And to the extent that the governors have an equity stake in the city-state or community that we're talking about, that would mean a direct wealth loss for them. So that's one way that we can think about it, right? Do we want to set up incentives such that the governors have no incentive to prey on the governed? The way that liberal democracies have previously gone is to divide power so that those who would prey cannot actually prey. There's checks and balances. So it's a complementary mechanism. It's not the same, but neither are they substitutes. I actually think they go well together. And so the idea is for future governance communities, how can you make these credible commitments that you're going to only use your power to make people's lives better and not worse? And that's where we start getting into things like competitive legal systems. I think it's Tom Bell who advocates the competitive legal system, ULEX, as a sort of way of getting a legal code that sort of transcends jurisdiction that can be quote unquote uploaded or run on particular governance communities in terms of coming up with rules that can help people live peacefully together. So I definitely don't think that the governance arrangements that we have today, by which I mean liberal democracy, I don't think that that's outdated. I don't think that that's wrong. I think that it just needs to be complemented by new experiments that also helps us understand, in addition to stopping internal predation via checks and balances, what can we do to actually incentivize those who govern not only to refrain from predation, but to only engage in those governance styles that actually increase the value of the real estate where people have to live, make it a more pleasant place to live, basically. So I think it's important that we remember that they're complements, not substitutes.
So one thing we should do before we skyrocket into what's potential in the future, let's take a step back. So in the arc of this conversation, we've talked about the collapse of Rome and how that led to competitive feudalism, which then sort of morphed into modern states. There was a spattering of competitive and polycentric governance, like in Prussia. But then after that, it's pretty much Westphalia from there. It's nation states, and they rule and they're centralized. But in your paper, Political Property Rights and Governance Outcomes, a Theory of Corporate Polity, you talk about a couple of new examples that emerge within the latter half of the 20th century that might point to what governance might look like in the future. Can you sort of explain some of those examples and how they can be helpful for future experiments?
Certainly. So I believe that that was one of the papers that I co-authored with my graduate student at the time, Glenn Furton, who's now a postdoc at NYU, who's doing some really interesting work on governance and public health. But the idea that we were getting at in that paper is, look, we can look at polities as a distribution of political property rights. We know that those political property rights can be attached to market mechanisms, and we know that the feedback between the two can actually give those who hold political property rights information about whether they're governing well or not. Basically, what's the value of the real estate that they're overseeing? What's the value of living in one of these communities? So this has all been more or less hypothetical up until this point. There hasn't been any concrete example of a city-state project exactly like this, but there have been a few what you might call case studies and polities that experienced rapid economic growth and development sort of like this. And so in the paper, we talk about the very small European Principality of Liechtenstein, we talk about Singapore, and we talk about Dubai. A lot of times people will dismiss Liechtenstein to the extent that they know about it at all because it is so small. I think the country has a population of slightly more than 30,000 people. But if you look at what happened to GDP per capita since the end of the Second World War, they still had pretty meteoric growth. And also as an academic myself, to anybody who thinks that managing a community of 30,000 people is easy, I suggest you go up to your local research university president or provost and dean and try telling them that their job is easy and anyone can do it. I'm pretty sure they'll set you straight pretty quickly. In terms of what's going on there in places like Singapore and Dubai, what we observe is payment schemes and compensation schemes for those who wield political power that strongly disincentivize corruption. And the way they do that is by paying administrators a very handsome salary and then coupling that with pretty harsh punishments if you're caught being corrupt. So in economics, we have this model called efficiency wages. It's basically a rational choice model of why employers might choose to pay employees above a market clearing wage. If they do that for any extended period of time, there's going to be permanent unemployment, because if you're paying higher than a market clearing wage, the amount of labor supplied is going to be higher than the quantity of labor demanded. The result is necessarily unemployment. Why would firms do that? The idea is if your next best option is unemployment and now you're getting an above market wage, the gap between the two is the size of your punishment. So it basically creates an artificially high wage as an incentive scheme to make the punishment for getting fired worse. And that's supposed to induce the right amount of effort to make sure that the employee actually contributes to helping the firm's bottom line. And so using techniques like this in the political arena, Singapore is famous, for example, for paying its administrators, especially its top administrators, exorbitant salaries, but is also very, very tough on people who are suspected of being corrupt. You can sort of take predatory governance off the table by making it incentive incompatible. And so obviously Singapore experienced meteoric economic growth. They had something like a 30-fold increase in per capita income since they were independent in 1965. Dubai has also grown very quickly, but since they're more dependent on, a little more dependent on oil, they're actually pretty diversified these days, but there's still that dependence on a single resource, so that makes them less viable. And if you want to talk about Liechtenstein, what you have there is development of markets through a constitutional system where it's very, very hard for even small majorities to impose their will on dissenting minorities. And so that creates a lot of stability for investment. And they also have a lot of good trade agreements with neighboring countries. The key to all of these things, though, is that you observe specific targeted mechanisms that attempt to connect political performance, political behavior with market mechanisms. It's not complete. It's not clear to me that you can get anything like complete unless you're actually starting a community from scratch. But there is a meaningful sense in which these polities are employing mechanisms that we would look to if we're actually thinking seriously about employing strategies for private governance.
So now that we had some time to go all the way from the Roman Empire up to Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew, the sky's the limit. In your case, quite literally, you wrote a paper called Settling the Final Frontier, the Orbis Lease and the Possibility of Proprietary Space Communities. Can you explain why this model is applicable to outer space and what it could look like?
Excellent. I'm really glad we had time to discuss this. So I like the way that you framed it. We've gone from classical antiquity through early modernity, through modernity, and now we're heading up to the stars. I like that progression very much. And so the idea from that paper started from a puzzle or challenge in public international space law. All the major spacefaring nations signed the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. One of the things that the 1967 Outer Space Treaty says is you cannot extend territorial jurisdiction to the moon or the other celestial bodies. So you can't extend United States territory to the moon. When the astronauts planted the flag there, it was purely a look what we just did thing. It was not in any way a jurisdictional claim. Now, presumably, there's going to be a time where we want to actually have space settlements on a more or less permanent basis. In fact, we're talking about doing that on the moon right now as a sort of extension of the Artemis program by NASA and US partner nations, eventually looking towards a manned mission to Mars. So assuming we get to the point where we want more or less permanent space settlements, how are those going to be governed? It can't be terrestrial law because we don't have a good mechanism for extending territorial jurisdiction into space. All the spacefaring nations said, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want a scramble for territory in the heavenly bodies. At the same time, if you wanted a sort of international consortium, putting it under the UN, that also has problems. International organizations like that are legendarily bureaucratic, and space isn't really an environment where you can afford to wait for procedures and deliberations. If something goes wrong, you need to fix it pretty quickly. So we can't rely on states. We can't rely on international organizations. Is there a way around this quandary? I say yes. You can actually have private, proprietary communities that run more or less like they would on Earth. The only difference is they're on the moon. They're on the moon. They're on Mars. And they're communities that actually charge fees to their residents for maintaining livable real estate, and that's the source of governance for profit. The important thing here is that this is not something that requires state support or state enforcement. As part of the Outer Space Treaty, states do have to continually monitoring their nationals in space. And so if you set up a corporate entity to run these proprietary communities, for example, you would need the United States government to monitor that entity on Earth and basically say, okay, you're allowed to do X things, but not Y things. But just because you've incorporated in a place and the host nation or host government is giving you instructions and conditions, that does not amount to a territorial jurisdiction in outer space. Right? The idea would be the actual entity itself, the corporate entity or the voluntary entity, operating outside of existing national jurisdictions would be doing the governance, and states would serve a valuable oversight function rather than actively providing the governance themselves. Again, I want to emphasize that this is complementary to state activity in space. I don't think that we're ever going to completely privatize space. It's not clear to me that it would be desirable even if we could do it. But I do think by the changing nature of the space governance and space technology landscape, what we're going to do is see the private sector playing an increasingly prominent role. And especially given these constraints according to public international space law, privately governed settlements and communities seem to offer very many attractive mechanisms for setting up a livable habitat while complying with public international space law.
So I might push back a little bit on the possibility there, at least for devil's advocate's sake, and I talked about this a little bit with Rick Tomlinson over at Space Fund, and it's sort of about the nature of governance and infrastructure. So a lot of the first states, like in China or in Sumeria, they were built around the necessity for large centralized infrastructure. Almost all of them were built around irrigation canals, the first states in China and the Sumeria. And you find something fairly similar with space travel. For one, supply chains are going to be fairly centralized. The capital needs in order to transport goods is enormously high. So there's probably only a few forms that can actually do it. And two, once you're actually on this, whatever planet it is, whether it's Mars or elsewhere, the infrastructure necessary to sustain life is better at economies of scale. So people can't have like Jeffersonian homesteads on the far ends of Mars. They're going to have to be in a set place, and that'll probably result in sort of a pretty centralized state. So on two different levels. One, even if states are not controlling the territory, can they exert influence by controlling the supply chains of those limited firms? And two, won't there be a more centralized order on the territory itself because of the infrastructure?
I think the answer to both of those questions has to be yes. States are going to continue to exert an influence through supply chains. As you mentioned, even with the innovations in rocketry advanced by firms like SpaceX, getting out of Earth's gravity well is still very, very expensive. And so that's going to select for firms that are in it for the long haul and are willing to ride down. But that also means that we're going to observe a relatively small number of players that are going to have a fairly hierarchical corporate decision structure. I don't think that there's any way to have outer space free from nation state influence, and I don't think that's the intent of the treaty. I think the intent of the Outer Space Treaty is just to make sure that we don't turn space into a permanent warfighting domain where we're actually combating other nations in space as we try to acquire Martian real estate or secure title to water on the moon. So within the limited confines of that treaty, I think we can actually outsource the actual running of governance settlements to corporate entities. Basically say, even though the United States is overseeing a corporate entity on its home office on Earth, the Martian real estate or lunar real estate itself is not U.S. territory. You are not in the United States if you're living in one of these settlements. So the other alternative, of course, is that these spacefaring nations get together and amend public international space law. But that's something that's going to require unanimous consent. And of course, that's very, very costly to achieve as well. So there's no really obvious way forward in solving these problems. I wrote that paper simply because I do think that there is a third option that not enough people are talking about. And maybe it's not the way that actually will be picked, but I think it's something that deserves serious consideration. And maybe it'll be something from which we can get some ideas to apply to whatever governance we actually do extend to the stars.
Well, I'm really glad you have a solid sense of realism, because it's desperately needed in these spaces, no pun intended. But for a final note before we conclude, what would you say to would-be sovereign entrepreneurs or political entrepreneurs that might be listening to this podcast?
Ooh. In terms of actual practitioners, that's very difficult. The hardest thing has got to be just getting off the ground. The hardest thing has got to be agreeing to getting some other nation state to agree to letting you to experiment with something in their territory, to actually building settlement in international waters that other people will need to leave alone. That's a huge hurdle. And it's going to take not only talented managerial competence to get that off the ground, it's going to take some serious long-term thinking and actual political acumen to navigate those trade-offs. Because this is happening against a backdrop of existing Westphalian states. They're still around. They're going to be around for a very, very long time afterwards. And so we're going to have to learn to live and cooperate with those. What I would say to them is, it's the project that you're embarking on is phenomenally important. Because again, what we're trying to build here is not a replacement, it's a complement. We want to find new ways of peacefully living to each other, that living with each other, that can teach us how to better extend the division of labor under peaceful cooperation and trade. And so it's one of those things where a lot of people are watching, and this is going to be a test case in the next couple of years to the next couple of decades about what sorts of feasible innovations in governance are actually on the table. So not only are you just trying to turn a profit, you're actually undertaking a task that is crucial for lighting the fire of the human imagination. So treat it like that. Don't just treat it like just another business venture. This is an experiment that could be permanently transformational for the human governance experience. And not only is that scary, that's frankly exciting. So have fun with it too.
Alexander, this is fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Joe. I had a great time.
Absolutely. And everyone, thank you again for joining us in the Start to Science Foundation podcast. Make sure to check out Alexander's work.